Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Dorigny. I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to the SNF Rendez-Vous de l'Institut, the Fellows Series. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening to hear our current fellow, Mohamed Elshahed. Mohamed is a curator and an architectural historian who studied at MIT and obtained his doctorate from NYU. Specializing in modernism in Egypt and in the Arab world, he's curated several shows, such as Cairo Modern, an exhibition at the Center for Architecture in New York that showed works by Egyptian modernist architects from the 1920s to the 1970s. And he's launched many groundbreaking, thought-provoking initiatives that encourage us to rethink urban spaces and the stories and histories that traverse our common spaces. Mohamed was also the person behind Modernist Indignation, the Egypt Pavilion, which won the 2018 London Design Biennale. I think that's such a wonderful name. And he also is the author of a book that's called Cairo Since 1900, an architectural guide, which came out in 2020. And so as I was preparing these notes, I dug into Cairobserver, which Mohamed founded and edited, which is an extraordinary bilingual English and Arabic online and print journal. And if you're looking for a rabbit hole, I guarantee you'll go be satisfied. I spent quite a lot of time on it, and it's just dazzling. And it brings together all these discussions in various forms of Cairo's architecture, history, urbanism, city life, conversations, aerial views, archives, you name it. It goes in every direction. It's beautifully done. And it started an important public debate about architecture and heritage and the everyday lives in those spaces. But he's also extended this reflection to where we see these histories, which is a museum space. And that brings us to 2016, where at the British Museum, he launched the Modern Egypt Project, an exhibition that brought the museum's collections of Egyptian objects into the 21st century by displaying everyday items. There's sewing machines, there's all sorts of ephemera, photographs, houseware, objects that are as many stories about Egypt as the last century developed. Mohamed is currently working on a book about this monumental experimental project, which tells stories about contemporary Egypt and the limitations and challenges of public spaces, or as he puts it, and I'm becoming a real fan of your titles, the liminal space between the official narrative and personal memories. And he has also entitled this talk, Accidentally Rebellious Projects and Objects. And at this point, I rest my case because what can I add?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm very grateful that so many of you showed up. We'll see how it will turn out, but I'm trying to basically tell you several stories, all of which have to do with me, because for the first time, I think because of this fellowship, I have the chance to reflect on, let's say, about 10 years or so of trying to write history, trying to tell stories about architecture and design and material culture in Egypt, which is a challenging space. And oftentimes the backstories became as interesting as the objects themselves. So Rebellious, we'll find out, maybe not so much, but Rebellious Objects is, Rebellious Things is the title of the book that I'm working here currently on, which has to do with the British Museum project that Marie mentioned, which I'll get to in a second. But first, I think it's really important to place ourselves. So I'm Egyptian, maybe, born in Alexandria, American by citizenship, which allows me to move around across borders, because otherwise I would be stuck in Egypt and probably would have never left. I'm also an immigrant, multiple times, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. I'm unable to go home and feel safe at the moment. I'm in Paris, feeling alienated. These are just some background as to who I am. This is the architecture I grew up with in Alexandria, Egypt. It was built in the 1960s. And to my mind, to my child eyes, this was normal. This was the world. And with handsome bodies posing in front of it as well. But as I grew up, a lot of this built environment has been devastating devastatingly erased, really haphazardly, violently, following various processes. Some of them are driven by stupidity by the state. Some of them are driven by the market. But the result is the same. History is being undone before one's eyes in quite a short span of time. In other geographies, neighboring countries, it might be wars, it might be other speculative processes, but at the end, there is kind of a widespread erasure and loss of memory. So this is where I come from in a snapshot. Because I do think it's important, as I tell you, 3 vignettes just to set the tone. So close your eyes and imagine with me that you're sitting in a rectangular room watching a situation unfold on the other side of the room. So imagine if kind of like, you're sitting here looking on this side. There's a dark-skinned Sudanese woman wearing a hijab who is being held by her wrist by a policeman in the usual all-white uniform. Another woman is involved, a light-skinned Egyptian with coiffed hair, fade blonde, the roots are showing. And she's claiming that the Sudanese woman instigated a fight with her, even though the Egyptian woman was in her car and the Sudanese woman was crossing the street. So I'm watching this story unfold before my eyes. The Egyptian woman was claiming that the Sudanese, when they got into a physical altercation, stole her necklace. We are at a prosecutor's office in Cairo, and I am watching this unfold in front of one prosecutor, as I am also sitting with another prosecutor. I'm being questioned about a set of objects that were collected for the British Museum, which were held a year earlier at the Cairo airport. So here I am watching this clear abuser in a situation who is making things up, and essentially kind of fueled by that narcotic mix of racism and classism that led the Sudanese woman to be left to leave the space in handcuffs, while to me, who was a clear aggressor, the Egyptian woman, got away with making claims that the poor woman stole her necklace, which probably never existed in the first place. So I'm being questioned at the same moment while psychoanalyzing this fake blonde who is accusing a poor woman of robbing her. I'm being questioned what is a curator and why are museums interested in these objects that you've collected. So very strange situation here, because in one version of the story, and this is the actual prosecutor's handwritten whatever they do. I don't know what they, because, also what part of this experience was witnessing how the law works. The entire thing was made up. The entire thing, not only of the situation I was watching in front of me unfold, but my own situation was made up. There was no reason for me to have been in that room, to have been questioned. It was a sort of sabotage, but I had to go through the legal process. So as I would say things, the prosecutor's note taker would say other things and write them down. So actually what I have as an object within itself is a document of that theatrical experience, as opposed to anything really grounded in reality in terms of, what are these objects collected by the British Museum for, and so on. And also to think about the situation itself, what objects should I have collected to tell these stories? What, the fake necklace that never existed, the interesting desk choices by the two prosecutors. One had a wooden neoclassical desk reflecting his style, while the other one had a very modern desk design. So one day would these desks belong in a museum to tell these very minute social stories of deception and classism and racism, and none of these objects could tell the story of what unfolded before me in that room that day. So this is vignette number 1. Vignette number 2 is at the British Museum in London, where now some of these objects have arrived, and we're having a meeting, the staff of the Egypt and Sudan department, of which I was the only Egyptian to ever be employed full-time by a department that was at the foundation of the museum in 1853. So the British Museum has established this, status of itself as such an important museum, partly based on its ownership of a huge Egyptian collection. Yet since 1853, they've never hired a full-time Egyptian. Ironically, also, I'm in the Egypt and Sudan department as an Egyptian. First time, who do I represent here, since everybody else is working on ancient antiquities, and I am hired to work on contemporary objects. So in that staff meeting, in the presence of the director of the British Museum, we have to speak around the room about our projects. And when the director who's been fired or left the museum since because of a scandal that you may have heard. Another kind of scandal. These kinds of stories don't make it to the news. They're just for our own struggles. I was told that the objects that I collected belong below, under the stairs. When asked where would I have imagined these objects being placed in a new display of the museum as part of this trendy decolonizing process that at the time, a few years ago, was on at least the meeting agendas of a lot of museums, decolonizing. So here's an opportunity, here's an Egyptian collecting contemporary objects. How are we going to deal with this? Well, under the stairs, and this was said by the French curator of the ancient Egyptian sculpture, who thought that that's what is important from from Egypt, not the everyday items that I collected for this project that the museum hired me for. So that's vignette number 2. Vignette number 3 is in Dubai. Here, this is a passport for the stateless, an art project by a graphic designer in his early 20s, 21 probably at the time. And he decided for this exhibition that I created in Dubai in 2016 to include a kind of an activist-y work for a 21-year-old, a passport for the stateless. When the items of the exhibition returned to Cairo, Egyptian customs treated, so the same customs that a few years later would hold me for the objects to go into the British Museum and question me and all of that. The same people, the legal system, stopped the passport, which is clearly a work of art, but dealt with it as if it was a real document. They ripped it, and with a red pen on every single page, they wrote void, 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 void. Because how dare someone create a passport for the stateless, let alone someone imaginary named Mohamed George, which is, scandalous. So the item suddenly, kind of provoked the state. What are we going to do with this document? Clearly fake, but we have to respond. So that's what they did. At the very same occasion, this graphic design, which says "Be with the revolution," in Arabic it's only 3 words, very simple, was popular around Egyptian cities from 2011 to 2013 when there was a kind of revolutionary fervor, and people used it as a stencil for graffiti. So it was all over Egyptian cities from the north to the south. So in that 2016 exhibition, I chose to include it since it became so iconic. Within hours of opening the exhibition, security walks in, rips it off the wall, including the double-sided tape, and they just walk right out. So what are we allowed to talk about? Because I don't know. It seems like there's always a very low ceiling, at least from, my position, from who I am, trying to work in these spaces, on these projects. The ceiling is pretty low. So if I were to start with this project in Dubai, I'll just tell you basically what I'm trying to do today is to walk you through a few projects and maybe along the way share personal stories, just to not just gloat about, oh, look at how great this project is, but actually highlight some of the uncomfortable and odd spaces one finds oneself in behind the scenes. Just to me, those are probably even more fascinating than the projects themselves. So you can see the empty spot where the "Be with the Revolution" poster was placed. Of course, 2016, Dubai, the UAE, had a very ambiguous still position in terms of what was going on in the region with regards to the revolutions. By now it's pretty clear they are the counter-revolution. They are, Raytheon and Boeing and whatever, all these companies that are war profiteers have their offices in Dubai. So "Be with the revolution" is not a message that you want yuppie 20-somethings to walk around and see, maybe be inspired by. I'm not really sure who gets inspired to actually revolt because of a poster. It was more of an expression of something that already existed. I don't think a poster in a gallery space by itself will instigate a revolution, but apparently the ceiling again is very low that such a message couldn't be included. The intention of the exhibition was much more peaceful, in the sense that it wanted to showcase contemporary Egyptian designers, mostly young people, working in a variety of fields, from product design to actually doing research on urban issues. An experience like this is really hard to grapple with when one is confronted in the late 2010s until the pandemic with this discourse around decolonizing design, decolonizing architecture, decolonizing history. Well, we can't even talk about some of these very, I would thought, non-provocative things like, be with the revolution shouldn't be that revolutionary. It's in itself, right? But, one follows these statements of decolonization by different organizations and museums, which have evaporated, I would say, by now. I think post-COVID, that conversation has just died out, which shows how inauthentic it was to begin with. These are the issues that one is working within. Okay, so another exhibit is the Cairo Modern show in New York, which was 2021 to 2022. And this was a fascinating experience. So on the one hand, this is it's the institution, right? It's the Center for Architecture in New York City. This is as official as it gets. Okay, can we have conversations about decolonization there? Not sure. I tried. But the idea of the exhibit was to, out of my book, which you can see in the foreground here, showcase a set of architects, some of their projects, the history they belong to, and place them within a continuum, a historical continuum that a New York audience would be familiar with. So there's a challenge here of not only introducing new material to a history, but to make sure that it's integrated within a wider history that an audience, sophisticated audience like New Yorkers should be able to see kind of in relation to one another as opposed to separate from, but sometimes being too honest is kind of a problem, right? So when I was talking about, for example, in this wall panel about architecture and research, you kind of have to mention that Egypt is a dictatorship and the US supports the dictatorship in Egypt, and that makes it very difficult to do research, and even, taking doing photography in the streets of Egyptian cities can get you arrested because, there is a kind of a ban on photography. So, okay, so this is part of the reality that one has to navigate, but like put it on the wall in an exhibition in New York City, you might get in trouble. Especially if, again, institutions are not very keen to actually tackle what it means to decolonize a history or a story about architecture and so on. I tried to include in that exhibition things that would link with the topic that I'm working on, which is Egyptian modernity, with the place where the conversation is being held. So an example is Egypt in 1939 was supposed to have a pavilion in New York City at the World's Fair there, and it didn't for several reasons, including the outbreak of World War II. But I thought, okay, here's an US, Egypt, New York story that kind of intersects somewhere there. So we should, expose this story in this setting. And I think it was successful to bring this into context for a New York audience. Even the sort of the butt cheek here was controversial. Again, I thought like, hey, New York City, why are we even, because there's children who will go to the gallery. Okay, I didn't realize that that's an issue now. So like you have to think about all these things. But, for me, this was interesting to see in full scale because it was a mural that was designed initially for the pavilion, had it been built in 1939. And it was published as a tiny little fragment in a magazine from a couple of years later in the early 40s. And so to be able to recover that tiny little pixelated image, expand it on the wall so that it is one-to-one scale, how it was originally intended for the first time in the city where it was supposed to be seen. Okay, I thought that was a worthwhile endeavor. And conversely, the other story panel that was told in that exhibition that might have challenged kind of untouchables like Frank Lloyd Wright, to kind of show the guy was kind of an a-hole when he went to Egypt. He didn't say very nice things to Egyptian architects. He basically went and told them off. They said, all this modern architecture that you're building is cheap. I haven't seen any cheap architecture like this except in Johannesburg, another African city. So he's been to 2 African places, and to his eyes, they had the cheapest kind of architecture. And so I wanted to show that perspective. I wanted to tell people in New York, again, we kind of idealize a figure like Frank Lloyd Wright. He's kind of an untouchable in the pantheon of the gods of modernism or something like this, imagined of some sort. But you never kind of see that meeting, what happened in a meeting when Frank Lloyd Wright met Egyptian architects in 1957 when he came to Cairo. So again, that's the kind of thing that's told in there. But I think what ended up being kind of the most controversial, which I don't still understand quite why, was a tongue-in-cheek exercise here. So about 100 years ago at this point, Le Corbusier, famous here in France, came up with 5 points toward a new architecture So I thought, well, I don't know when my next chance to do an exhibition in New York City or the US will be, so let me have my 5 points. So my 5 points 100 years later were 5 points to decolonize architecture, both in practice and in history. And I thought they were pretty straightforward. For example, recognize that history is never a linear progression. That's a pretty challenging concept for some people who insist that history is a linear progression of figures, individuals, events, and so on, and styles. To approach this history that I'm trying to introduce through architects, buildings, and other kind of micro stories that one is able to dig up from the press or the archives needs to be kind of seen within a conceptual idea of how to approach this stuff. So let's get rid of this very linear conception of history, number one. Felt pretty straightforward. Didn't go down. A lot of people didn't accept it so well. To say straightforward that Eurocentrism is primitivism, because it's actually not about the kind of design, but Eurocentrism, by assuming that everybody else is kind of unequal, that's within itself from a humanist perspective, that is what primitivism would be, right? So to say that on the wall in a New York City gallery, again, a little bit. I had to actually explain out loud why colonialism was even a relevant concept to an audience there. So you have to survive the thing, and then you're supposed to also keep a straight face while explaining the thing to the people who are doing the thing. It's a little bit rough. You just simplify it into words and put it on the wall and see what happens, because otherwise it's going to be challenging on our psychology. So, that didn't work out, I think, for a lot of people. And I can see this from both the audience was quite large for the exhibition in terms of visitorship, to the point that the venue extended it by 2 months. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, the intelligentsia, the critical circles, they really were, and I had a couple of interactions from big magazines, for example. I had to basically not do an interview or accept to be watered down. And all the real issues that I'm trying to raise to, be buried down. Like, if we want to talk about colonialism and why these are issues that we should talk about in Metropolis as a magazine, from a specific interview that actually happened in relation to this, it wasn't acceptable. They basically wanted to just print the press release at the end after an extensive interview, because I talked about real issues, right? So it seems like, again, the ceiling is pretty low in terms of what can be said. And you can see the rest of the points on the screen. So, that was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, yes, but it was also pretty serious. I think, we need to decenter architectural knowledge. We need to not think of history as a linear process and so on. But then the other thing that I thought was actually really important to do is to then put the 20 buildings that were in the exhibition in kind of context and historical context and visualize it on the wall so it's easy for people to see. And then from there, it grew into this timeline project, which I didn't necessarily start this exhibition thinking would even be necessary from my point of view, but then I realized it is very much necessary. I don't know if you can make out a lot of, obviously not because of the tiny scale, but it starts at 1900 to 2000. Most of the buildings in the exhibition were from the 20s to the 70s, but somehow to paint a historical picture, one needs to go back a little bit and then forward a little bit from the time frame that's mostly being represented in the projects. And then, if there were architects associated with buildings, well, now I needed to add them to the timeline, when they were born, when they died. If they established magazines, well, let's put those too. If there were big political events that shaped their career and life, well, let's add those. So the timeline kind of grew organically, bit by bit, to kind of become a richer tapestry of people, events, places, things that somehow, I think, just as a tool, can help think of kind of the provisional nature of what we understand as history, because it keeps changing as we know more or less or however. And I just thought it was a really useful exercise to put this on the wall. These are magazines that are established by an architect that I'll mention in a second. But back to the timeline, after the exhibit in New York, I thought, okay, a lot of people reached out and they wanted a PDF of the timeline. So the timeline became this important thing for a lot of people. Okay, great. I thought, instead of sharing the PDF, why don't I do a web version of it so that it lives online in some format? So this is live. It was a little project that I did a couple of years ago, right after the exhibit closed in March 2022. It was right around that time. So it's a timeline.com. And the idea is the same, but actually doing it as a web tool was more well, not maybe more, but it is exciting in a different way, because the image on the wall is obviously going to be still once it's printed. But what's nice about this is it can evolve. So I can keep adding buildings, architects, events, and people can theoretically suggest what should be added, exhibitions. So there's a lot more room to include things. And then the lines that you see are actually connecting the lifespan of a thing. So if it's a building that was built in 1 year and then demolished, and we have those dates set, so you can see the line appear and disappear. Same thing with the birth and death of individuals and so on. So sometimes projects kind of one births another project without even really I never had an intention to do this, but it was a byproduct of the timeline that was just one element in that New York exhibit. Okay, so I am trying to tell a story here, which is of an architect, and I'm realizing how much one is. We talked about obsessions among the fellows, like everybody has their obsession. Well, my obsession turned out to be this guy in one way or another, probably because I foreshadowed that I'm going to live an aspect of his predicament, finding myself also restricted in terms of expression and ability to work, and having a very contentious relationship with the country that I'm supposed to be focusing on in my work. So Sayyid Karim, in a nutshell, is for the lack of a better word, modernist architect. He's an architect who practiced mostly from the late 1930s up until the mid 1960s. This is his own house, which still stands. Very beautiful kind of conglomeration of bits and pieces of ideas that he developed in his architectural studies and practice. These are some examples of his work in downtown Cairo. So pretty prominent. We're not talking about someone who only had a few projects here and there. He was pretty well established. This is him with state officials in the 1960s. He even produced theoretical projects in terms of not just practical commissions for specific buildings that are asked by paying clients, but he also kind of, in his free time, created things just because he likes to think about architecture, theoretical projects. And then, he designed this, what was proposed at the time. If you're following Egyptian news now, you know that for the last few years, Egypt has built a new capital. So this has an old history that starts in one version with Sayyid Karim as well, who proposed a city that was promoted to the public at the time as a new capital of the city of the revolution that was really a CIA-backed coup d'etat, but revolution nonetheless, right? And we're going to build a city and all of that. The stadium was the centerpiece of the project, which he didn't get to do. The project actually ended up going to a reformed Nazi architect who built the 1936 Olympic Stadium in Berlin. So here's a situation in which whatever the backstory is, at the end of the day, after World War II, not too long after, a post-colonial independent country has an architect who's a star. His main project to build a big city that's being promoted by the state as the city of the revolution. The commission of the centerpiece, regardless of what the backstory was, ends up being done by a Nazi architect, because by 1950-something, his Nazi association was forgotten, right? But he was German. He was an expert. The diplomatic machine is working to make sure these people stay in work, in business. And shortly after, Sayyid Karim himself goes under house arrest in that beautiful villa that I showed in the beginning right here. So someone with a lot of aspiration to build and to change the nature of the built environment in his country in the post-colonial setting, context, story, moment, actually ends up being put under house arrest and lives for 5 decades and never recovers professionally. So tell me about decolonization. Let's talk about what that really means. Because it seems like it didn't really mean much in the 50s and 60s, right at the moment when it was supposed to happen. So I'm not sure what conversation we're supposed to be having now on the theme, on the topic. One of those realities is that an Egyptian going to display something in London, half of the budget needs to go to the rental of the room, which is actually a historic building that was used by the British Navy, which attacked my city not that long ago. So decolonization, right? We're going to include Egyptian voices and people from the global south to tell us their stories, but pay £17,000 first, Okay, backstories, right? They are part of the reality. The exhibit itself didn't cost that much. But here it is. Side note, my mother died the same week, but we had still did the work done. So, like life is complicated. And here I am sitting in London trying to make sure that this thing gets done. But why? Because the architect that I just showed you, he has a pretty heartbreaking story. 3 decades of practice. First Arabic language magazine in the world to tell the story of contemporary architecture and design in his country. Lasts for 20 years, hundreds of buildings. Aspiration to have a regional practice, not just to stick to Egypt. House arrest at 50-something. Stay at home, shut up, out of the scene. So I want to tell his story, and I want to tell his story in London. So what you see here is a volume of the very first year, the complete first year of the magazine he established. Like I said, the first Arabic language magazine in architecture and design in Egypt. And Mercedes Voulé, who's here, pioneered work about the magazine, listed basically everything that was in it, and published that in the late 80s. So I, couldn't have continued what I, basically this kind of work without this foundation. But the story needs to be told, and it needs to be put in its context, in its historical context. And to add a human touch to it, because this is a broken man. This is someone who is had the potential, became broken because of the setting in which he had to live and work, and also the delusion of things like independence, which clearly crashed on his own head so shortly after. So the exhibit itself tried to contextualize this by, for example, talking about key historical moments that were happening at the time. Again, I'm working with a very small budget. London, most of the money ends up having to go to the venue just to host the exhibit. So we worked with basic materials like mirrors, kind of in a also tongue-in-cheek thing, so that you can, constantly looking at yourself as you're reading the story that you're learning about. But not only architecture out of context, but also to include, like I said, the political and the cultural context that was happening around the architecture. So the Cairo fire is one of the stories that were told in the space. Sayyid Karim's own office was lost to the fire. So his entire archive, basically, more or less, was lost in 1952. He still continued to have a career until 1965, the house arrest. So, as one struggles with, you fall one time, you get up again, and well, here's a story that one is reading and writing about of someone that literally having these very serious setbacks in his life and career, but persisting until no longer is able to. So the house is included in there, the magazine, the political context, like I said, and then we made a short video filmed in the house, which still stands. And I thought that was important just to kind of convey the emotional aspect of all of this. And the theme of the exhibit in which this particular installation was in was emotional states. So I thought it would be nice to think about the emotional state of someone who is trapped in his own design for 7 years, not leaving. So before that, he was known in the Egyptian press as the flying architect, because he had aspirations and he did fly quite a lot across the region for his project. So there is a kind of an irony here in someone being famous by the mid-40s as the flying architect, who then gets trapped in a cage, right? So this kind of, so I'll show you the entire 2.5 minutes, because it's not that long.
ما هي العمارة؟ لقد كانت العمارة وستبقى دائما سجلا يقرأ فيه تاريخ العصر الذي سيرته وثقافة ومدنية الشعوب التي تطورت معهم. لقد انتهت العمارة من كونها فرعا من فروع الفن. لقد انتهت العمارة عن كونها رداءً خارجياً، رداءً مستعاراً لإظهار درجة ومكانة ساكنيه. لقد بدأت العمارة تتحرر من قيود الماضي لتسير مع التطور الحديث. لقد بدأت العمارة تتحد في جميع أنحاء العالم. بدأت تسير في اتجاه الطراز الدولي لارتباط دول جميع العالم الحديث ببعضها. فاتحدت الصناعات وتبادلت مواد الإنتاج التي عليها تعتمد العمارة الحديثة. العمارة هي فن الصراحة في الإنشاء، فن نسبه وأشكاله التي هي مقياس كماله، هي النسب والأشكال التي حددها وفرضها علم الإنشاء تباعاً للمواد التي تنشأ بها والمنفعة التي تقيدها حاجيات الإنسان.
So the text that was being read is from this text. Sayyid Karim wrote an editorial in 1939 titled "What is Architecture?" and is being read by Shahida Fahmy, who's a rare woman architect practicing in Egypt today, whose career, like him, was also affected by the revolutionary, the attempt to have a revolution in 2011 in this case. So kind of this, again, relationship between the architect and the political shift in revolutionary and political context. I wanted to make that connection between past and present by having her read the text. And everybody that worked on this video, for example, is like 22. You know, the model, the music is made by a 21, 22-year-old, and the film, the crew that worked on it, and so on. So, just think it's important to give that backdrop as well. You know, there are young people who are learning about this history for the first time themselves, and they're very eager to engage and create things. So when I present the idea, people jump on it, and we produce a video like this in one day. Not bad. Okay, so I think I give a few projects so far, and I give you those vignettes. I want to go back to this idea of objects and these sort of grand moments in history. So the High Dam. The High Dam is probably one of those mythologized projects or maybe even objects in the landscape, right? It's Egyptian-Soviet friendship of some sort is the official story. But I just wanted to also think about not only someone, let's say Karim, got screwed by the clash between reality and official narratives. So in 1965, like I said, he was put under house arrest. At the same time, most people in France would be familiar with the name of Youssef Chahine as a film director. Well, he too got screwed around the same time by the same thing, really, the same force. He was asked to make a movie about the High Dam. So I'll show you a scene. I'll show you a couple of scenes from this High Dam movie, but because he decided to not present an official discourse kind of accepted narrative, so it just comes back to the same theme, I think, even in my own practice today, working in spaces like Dubai, New York, and Cairo, and having these kind of limitations and low ceilings. Here's someone in the 60s confronted with this in different ways, right? He's instead of centering the greatness of the dam, he centers a Nubian boy whose entire community and village is lost, whose entire urban physical habitation settlement is lost, who by the end of the movie we see as a shoe shine in Cairo. So you start, here's this heroic national project, and an emerging young film director is asked to make a film about it with a huge budget, Soviet and Egyptian support behind the movie. He doesn't want anybody to intervene. And then on its screening day, there's a movie about a black boy from southern Egypt who loses his village and then becomes a shoe shine in Cairo. I don't know. I don't think they were excited. So the entire movie got burned. And only one copy was smuggled to Paris. And this is the one that was restored in the 90s. And this is the one that we're going to watch. Weirdly enough, he goes into exile, so he's unable to stay in his own country because how dare he talk about, like this other unofficial kind of storyline or perspective. Goes to Lebanon, lives for a few years, made some movies there. But then when Nasser dies in 1970, the state kind of tries to pull him back into Egypt, and then he's forced to make a second version of the same movie. So very strange. So I'm going to show you actually clips from both versions of the same movie, the one he wanted to make and then the one I think he had to make with a gun to his head.
اضرب الرعد ده موت وريني كده فين الموت من الفيديو ماشي حاسب تغرق يا براء والله اذا نبت من الدبش للطيار يغرقه
وخلال الصراع مع تيار النيل الغاضب عاد براق ونيكولاي على أمواج الزمن إلى الماضي. لينينغراد، النوبة لينينغراد، حيث كان كل منهما طفلا ذات يوم، وإذا كل واحد منهما يسمع نداءات من بعيد، واختلطت أصوات الأمهات واختلطت الأسماء، أحدها من لينينغراد نيكولاي والآخر من النوبة براق، كما اختلطت مصائر روحين يمكن أن نعتبرهما إنسانا واحدا. براق نيكولاي براق.
خبيني خبيني انت فين يا ولد؟ طيب انت هربان من المدرسة، انا لازم اوريلك النهارده.
So the movie starts with this kind of almost homoerotic encounter between a Russian engineer and a Nubian young man. And the ways in which the development of the project of the dam was represented very much in a very street view perspective, not the state looking from above. So this is the approved version of the movie as opposed to the first version. So the movie is titled People and the Nile. And the movie, the original movie, was really about human relationships and stories, these characters and how they deal. But as you can see in the official version post-19 that was released in 1972, the name doesn't match what the end movie was anymore, because it says People in the Nile, but all we're supposed to celebrate is the great infrastructural project. That was the ending of the approved version. This is the ending of the burned version.
تاكس دقيقة واحدة.
مستر 50 بيس. طب عشان خاطر 25. طب بلاش.
سامعين؟ انا قليل الادب.
مش دي التانية.
يقول عليا انا قليل الادب. طب ودي اهو اوعى تقول عليه.
Yeah, so the original ending is with the poor boy being displaced and working as a Shushan in Cairo, where the approved ending is of the dam gushing its waters and, you know, creating the new nation and so on. Of course, now we know much more about the story and the devastation that was done to an entire segment of society, their history and so on. And some of this is being published way, way after the fact now. But of course, also, you know, that political context for the great project wasn't what people thought. You know, much more recently, we learned about Project FF, which I'm not going to say out loud, but you can read what FF stands for, an actual CIA operation that predated the 1953 coup d'etat assisted by the US in Iran. This is a year earlier in Egypt, but ultimately kind of did the same thing. And this news only became declassified and released during the 2011 revolution, so nobody even paid attention. The regime that created the grand Soviet developmental project was actually kind of initially backed by the US. So what objects is one supposed to collect for a museum in London to talk about this historical moment? I found this object, which I would have never even encountered, I think, in my education in any other way. But while doing field work, I learned that despite this massive development project that took about 10, 15 years of really sucking the energy out of an entire population in the south of Egypt with the promise of electricity, modernization, and so on, people living in the vicinity had no access to this electricity. So they were making these. These are homemade oil lamps. So you have a huge contrast between the image that's been through propaganda with cinema, that was the intention of the original movie, to paint that one picture, and then you have the material reality that says there's another existence that happened right next to this massive dam project. People actually didn't have any electricity because all of it was funneled to the factories and to the north, because it is very much a divided country with a population heavy north, less people in the south, and so on, whiter people in the north, darker people in the south. So actually all the energy was drawn up, and this is what people were making in the vicinity of the dam just to have some light at night. So this is now in the British Museum's permanent collection. Good luck trying to convince both Egyptian authorities that that's okay, and the person who wants to put this kind of object under the stairs that this is worth any historical value. That's where I had to be, right? Between a rock and a hard place. That's been my life. But just a quick backstory on why the British Museum has this to begin with. It does have to do with the idea of rebellion, because suddenly, with 2011 unfolding, 70% or so of the British Museum's visitors go to see the Egyptian collection, and suddenly Egypt is on the news every day, and it's not Tutankhamun that's on the TV, right? It's like, teenagers bloodied in protests and all of this. So suddenly the British Museum wanted to respond by having items in its collection to talk about Egypt since the last time, I guess, they have anything to represent for it. So hundreds, thousands of years, anything more recent. But of course, I'm not going to get too much into it. The Egyptian collection, like I said, was always, this is the Great Hall with the stone items that's still there, that the French curator that wants to put my stuff under the stairs is responsible for. I wish I can be responsible for that. The Egyptian collection in the museum starts from the very beginning, 1753, and it does include other items from other historical periods like the Coptic and so on, Islamic, more recent even, there's a brick mold from the early 20th century, some art and banknotes and postcards, but nothing more than that. So when Egypt became such a topic on the news in 2011 or so, this project was initiated because of the rebellion that was happening. And so it's an experimental project in the sense of nobody really had a playbook for how to do such a thing, because these big museums and don't necessarily collect these types of items, not for this kind of geography. And then you have the rules and regulations in a place like Egypt that tells you what can be exported, what can be exported, what do museums do, what don't museums do. This is not how we want to represent Egypt to the West, because, it's all about tourism, so you need to put nice, fancy, shiny things, because that's what attracts people, not a tin can that tells a story of poverty alongside the high dam. Challenging. So actually, when this exhibition happened in 2018, in the summer of 2018, that had already been after half of the items for the project were held at Cairo airport by customs, because they were so confused. Why is this going to the British Museum? And hence my encounter with the prosecutor's office, watching that other story unfold before my eyes. So half of the items collected for the project were stuck in Cairo on the airport floor, and I had to sort of make do with what was there, including by the most expensive item in the whole project, which was from eBay, I think, Sunny Egypt. That was like the most expensive item. So that was on eBay, that made it out. But otherwise, it was really difficult to compensate for some of the things that were held back. But I just want to give you some highlights of some of the items that were included in this collection. So bear with me here, because I really had to try my hand at what I can do within these very ambiguous institutional settings, legal framework, who I am, double, citizen, Egypt, US, are you a spy, all of these things. So some of the items, and I can put them here to maybe give them some meaning side by side. So on the one hand, you have items that deal with sort of representations of the state as a monarchy. So these wooden items would be commissioned by individuals so that they can hang them outside their business when the king doesn't have a parade, so that the king notices them. So kind of like a very basically poor, normal, and middle-class people trying to get the attention of the king when he has some sort of parade by commissioning these royal insignia to put outside their shops. So there's a lot of those, but they're all kind of unique. It's not exactly mass-produced in the sense that they're all identical, but there's a lot of them. So it shouldn't be an issue to export one or two for a museum display. On the other hand, is a plate from the 1970s under Sadat with the presidential insignia then. So you can kind of see the representations of the state in these two items side by side, the eagle and the other thing with the royalty symbols. There are ID cards that represent people from different segments of society, somebody who actually works in customs at the port, someone who's a school teacher, and so on. Typewriters, which turned out to be a whole story because of this project. Turned out that we don't really know when the Arabic language was mechanized, and then a whole research project opened around that. Because of this thing that I found half in the mud in a marketplace, but then suddenly it turned out to be a state-commissioned typewriter as part of an early 20th century project by the state to modernize, is to basically mechanize all the writing. And this is why it says very officially writing machine Egypt, ironically hand-painted on the mechanizing machine for writing. Life is weird. Other things that came my way. And sometimes really it's kind of like operating like some sort of open arm net and see what comes your way and sticks, So it's not like I know that these items exist before going out there to get them. It's just sometimes kind of like, wow, really, this existed? For example, a school poster to teach young Egyptian children in schools about the British, who are colonizing them violently as they are in school, looking at this poster. So the British in the 1930s and 40s, really the height of British colonialism in Egypt, pretty violent, women raped in the street type of situation, are family-oriented, sporty and democratic, because they have this like fancy parliament thing, and industrious, so straight up propaganda right in the height of World War II era for school children. I think it would be pretty cool to see this in the British Museum in London. So maybe the British people can have some self-reflection about what it means to be a colonial society. You know what I mean? Not a bad idea. Because nothing really within the museum's collection opens that kind of conversation. I mean, can you name an item or two? They don't really exist, Okay, some other things are more standard, but I thought it was okay to include as well, like furniture, a lot of magazines. Because I'm an architecture person, I guess I am, I was very attracted to things that include everyday items that are not made for architects, that include the visual kind of DNA of representing architecture in a certain way. So, calendars, photography, envelopes, and so on. So a variety of things. Musical instruments. This is another place where architecture pops up in an unusual location. Cigarette boxes. Apparently, always, which Egypt was a huge marketplace and exporter of tobacco at some point, at least as packaged tobacco. On the front, there would always be some sort of ancient Egyptian oriental thing. And on the back, there would always be the modern facilities in which the cigarettes are being manufactured. So it's a document within itself, because you can actually see where the place where this thing is being made. Pretty beautiful architectural representation of a place in the city of Port Said. and so on. So really quite a wide variety. This is a sewing machine that turned out to be, it's called Nefertiti. This is who you're looking at here, which Egyptians have never seen since she's German. And that was a joke. And again, it's the Arab hand-painted insignia saying Nefertiti. It turned out that this is a patented design in the Czech Republic, or this at the time was Czechoslovakia, that was purchased by the Egyptian government with one of those maybe half-fulfilled promises of we're going to help illiterate women, poor women, to make money by providing them with sewing machines. So it's kind of part of this big social program that's targeted at women. So I would say would be a significant item in an Egyptian museum. No Egyptian museum is interested. You will never see this in Egypt in a museum. Let's do one of those things where hundreds and thousands of people sign a petition online and nothing happens. Let's do one of those. We're still not going to have one of those in a museum. It's not going to happen. Because this is not the type of item that an Egyptian museum, under the current neo-colonized structure, is interested in showing, because it talks about social history, it talks about everyday people. Right now, this whole infrastructure is designed for the lovely people in this room and their friends who can fly to Egypt and do a tour bus thing to the pyramids and a swimming pool and have second-grade beer on the Nile. So social history, material history related to everyday people, that's not part of the conversation. Headwear like this, not a single museum in Egypt even tells you about what the tarbush, the fez, and the various types, that would have been worn by different kinds of sheikhs. The one that reads the Quran at a funeral versus the one that recites it somewhere else. They all have different headwear. Most Egyptian youth today, including myself, up until I saw this stuff, would have no idea. This is actually how you maintain colonialism, by making these very recent aspects of everyday life completely unknown. And not creating any spaces for them. Mercedes, you came to this. Half of the people were informants. It was great. I love informants because I know them and they know me and I know them. We just looked at each other. It's like, I know why you're here. They're like, I know why you're here. We just have to play this game and pretend. It's just like living in a dictatorship is fun. Takes the whole role-playing thing to a new level. So this was the first batch of items that were collected for this project. And within only a couple of months, I wanted to have a display where the Egyptian public can come in, talk, engage. What do we do with these items? What are the questions that they raise? The two big ones were, what's Egyptian about this? And what's modern about this? Because it turned out that a lot of Egyptians have no idea what's Egyptian. And it turns out that a lot of Egyptians don't agree, and probably many people in this room, about what we can call modern. Historians would have an idea, maybe some other, everybody seems to have an idea, but when you put actual stuff on a table and tell people, this is kind of a museum thing, but you can touch it, it's not untouchable, and, suddenly they recognize things from their grandparents' houses or their own houses, or they can, something is, it's a Czech patented design, but made for an Egyptian user. How do you identify this as Egyptian? Some of the other items I'll show you, the very DNA of the object is like multinational. So how do you present this as a kind of an object that belongs to a certain national history? But we do this in the West all the time, right? Everything is made in China, but like nobody would question how American your iPhone is. But trust me, it's not made in California. It's designed there. It's not made there. So like those are actually pretty relevant questions for all of us. But like when you said it in that, early 20th century Egypt, is it colonized? What does that mean? An object that has woodwork from England, a musical instrument machine like a cigarette box that was included. It has a music machine in the bottom that's Swiss. The woodwork is English, and then there's arabesque that's Egyptian. But the item altogether only made sense in an upper-class downtown Cairo setting where it was used as a cigarette box. If you took it to Switzerland, it wouldn't mean anything, even though it has a Swiss part. If you took it to England, it was just a nice oriental box. So anyway, the DNA of a lot of these items was very much complicates the question of what's an Egyptian item, to talk about the modern and contemporary period. All right, I'm coming to an end here, but because you did mention Cairobserver, I thought, okay, I'll include a little bit of this. Obviously here I was inspired in my own research as a student, and then trying to do some of these projects with magazines as being extremely important in the context that I was working in. So archives are inaccessible largely because of security reasons. And the press was highly controlled, but it was abundant. So there's a lot of publishing and printing. You have to read between the lines, and sometimes you do find some really interesting nuggets. So in my own research, so I thought, okay, I'm going to continue this and create sort of a magazine-y zine thing in my own. As I'm doing my research, I'm going to create something. So Cairobserver was that. It lives on social media, mostly on Instagram these days. It kind of migrates and is nomadic like myself. So, you know, Tumblr was really popular some years ago. It was on Tumblr. Instagram is where everybody is zoning out. So this is where it is now. So you can find it on Instagram and enjoy my bursts of opinions. Anyway, so some pages of the magazine. I mean, the idea was to really create also a magazine that builds on the history of graphic design that I discovered in my research. So to kind of connect it to the present, not look at it necessarily in a nostalgic way, but actually take it as cues for coming up with so a lot of graphic designers were instigated to create something that feels Egyptian to them, but also is aware of the history of graphic design that I was finding in these older magazines, and to Arabize a lot of the content about heritage, not to make a separation between urban architecture, urban design, urban history, architecture, material culture. You know, these institutional divisions didn't really apply once I was in this field and having a foot. I only have 2 feet, but I have a foot in each one of these. So the magazine itself is also kind of bridging urban design, urban history, material culture, and architecture, and graphic design, and cinema. So they all kind of come together, and to Arabize a lot of this content so that it's available. Just to kind of trigger a discourse, that's grounded in the place that we're working in. You can see a lot of these photos already are recycled in different ways, you know. And for example, you know, even just a side note, thought about the backstory that would never make it in a history of a project. You know, all the printing was done in a facility that was run by the deaf and the mute, right? So like, do you put this in a history of something? No, I guess not, but it mattered to me because that's actually where I spent hours and hours and hours to put these prints together. So it was a charity that employs the deaf and the mute, and that's where we printed everything. Again, the designers are always very young. The content is pretty rich, you know, and it ranges from, this one was a much more academic type of zine. Others are actually sourced, the content was sourced by students, young people, faculty. I don't really believe in hierarchies of any sort, and you know, so I guess I would like to see how that would manifest it if I were to be an editor and to try that out. So that's what I try to do there. I hope I'm enticing you with some of this graphic design. I think it's gorgeous, if I may say myself. I'll end with my book, Cairo Since 1900, because, the one that I'm working on here is a compendium to this book. So whereas this book is about architecture and it's done in a guide format, the one that I'm working on here is about objects, like the ones you've seen, and also presented more or less in a guide-y format. The idea is to think about the spaces we inhabit, not just as architecture as the shell and separate from the material history that is within. So the two books together can paint a picture of the buildings and then the things in the buildings. That's kind of the idea. So a lot of this came out of when I was a student as doing my PhD. A lot of the material that was poured into this book, and I'm glad it did, just because of how things turned out. But the idea was to really make it accessible immediately. Just because of this demolitions situation that I showed you in the very beginning, like literally the cities are being wiped clean, like a clean slate. So there was a kind of an urgency to make a lot of this history accessible, not to speak to an academic audience, but also not to water it down so much that it's unattractive to an academic audience. So it's a bit of a challenge to find a space in between where it's a guidebook, yes, but it's for the first time to see something like this in this kind of format with this type of material. Yes, the material may exist out there in magazines and other research before, but it's the first time to be able to hold one object and flip through 200 plus buildings from 1900 to the present in Cairo. And to not be motivated by tourism, but actually motivated by people walking around the city, that they're not encouraged to walk around, frankly, and certainly not encouraged to take pictures, since you can get arrested for just taking a picture of a building. I went to the police station many times just for taking pictures for this book. And then the nice thing that happened alongside with that project is that my dissertation, which was the foundation of a lot of this research and material, was translated and published in Arabic as well. So I feel at least I can check that box, like, okay, I did the Arabic thing, you know. I'm not one of those people who go to Egypt, do a PhD research, and then get a job in Stanford and never publish their work in Egypt, which everybody does, by the way. Nobody goes back to the sites of research that Egypt and others are like it, that are rich in material. Very few people go back and publish their work in that place that gave them so much careers, you know, material to write about. So I thought it was really important to not be one of those people and to actually see my work translated and published in Arabic and doing well as well. Just one last little thing, because I started with Dubai and the security man walking in to take be with a revolution poster, because they're so sensitive about being such anti-revolutionary dumbwits of empire. So I'm going to end with another project, which is in Sharjah, the neighbor of Dubai, where ironically the new edition of this exhibition, the Triennial of Architecture, the Sharjah Triennial for Architecture is just opened last week. There's a problem, again, to go back to my main concern of what does it really mean to talk about decolonization in this context, So a rich Arab country is now going to do patronize architecture exhibitions. This is going to be the moment, right? Now we're going to all be hired to tell our stories. No, that's not what happens. They go to London, they recruit people from London, they actually play with identity politics. So, for example, this year, it's a Nigerian-British curator. Meanwhile, Nigerians are not allowed at the moment to get visas to go to the UAE. But because the audience that is targeted by these events is actually the British and American, New York, LA, the big city, how do you reproduce the coloniality of colonialism? That's how you do it, actually. You play with identity politics, you cater to that audience in those cities, as if this region has nothing to tell, no people to do any of this work. So I was in the unfortunate position of discovering this firsthand, because, again, the first edition of the exhibition had a London Arab British curator who knew nothing about the region. So poor, local regional people got given the smallest budgets and given the smallest rooms away from the main site, but the Columbia University professors got the biggest commissions. That's the reality we work in. So you may teach decolonization on the curriculum in New York, but you will jump on that opportunity to take the biggest chunk of a Global South exhibition because it gives you space to, make money. So just the challenging behind the scenes, I think, aspects, the realities that we grapple with, because I've become very uncomfortable with giving formal presentations based on theory, on what decolonization means, recycling this over and over, and realize that in the world that we actually inhabit, in practice, none of it matters. So I think we're needing a new language, we're needing a new sense of sort of grappling with actual experiences that people who have, done their groundwork. I got a PhD, I really tried, I really tried to do this thing. So let me speak when I'm going to have a room, and don't censor me and don't give me the smallest budget, and. If we're serious about any of these seismic shifts that we should be having during moments like this. So where to go from now? Latin America, baby. I love it. So that's where I'm going. The welcome that I'm just going to show two little snippets. Brazil, Mexico, incredible. Full room, full of, huge audience, young people, interested, genuine, sophisticated with their engagement with these questions because they live them themselves. And they have a local discourse that has emerged, at least in a place like Brazil, at least in a place like Mexico. There has been a conversation that is not concerned with catering to what the American or European audience has to say about these issues. There's really good exhibitions, there's really good publications. They're all in Spanish or all in Portuguese, and they're speaking mostly to a local audience. As someone coming from this region that's completely screwed up these days for a couple of decades, since my parents were born in the middle of World War II, this is a breath of fresh air. So, I tried to engage with an audience in Brazil, went really well, with an architecture school in Salvador de Bahia, not even in the Rio or in Sao Paulo. Full auditorium, fantastic engagement. And the same in Mexico, was able to do events, engage with an audience, engage with what they're working on that's parallel to my topics, engage with some more profound conversations, I would say, and even be allowed space to express my own approach and my history, personal and professional, because I really don't think, just like I don't think the disciplines should be so, have such hard borders, just like hard borders have failed the very project of decolonization. The ironic thing about decolonization is the post-colonial nation state has a hard border that the people before were able to move across when they were supposedly in a worse situation. Now it's actually much worse. It's much more solidified, and I feel that this translates into the disciplines where people get really committed to, we do the architecture thing here and then the photography thing there. I guess, again, engaging with people in a place like Mexico has allowed me to just be myself. I do photography, I write, I include the personal and the professional. I don't see the separation between the two. But I still do publish book chapters when I can, or academic work when I can. This particular one is a chapter knocking down a German art historian who wrote about everything from women's architecture to the Japanese architecture, African architecture, Arab architecture. If I do that today, no one will take me seriously. But if you're German, you can have a career for 5 decades. So, other writing forms, I guess, is kind of criticism. Whenever, again, space is allowed for this. I recommend this piece, Demolitions and the Urgency of Architectural History in Egypt, which, again, because the demolition and destruction is such a huge topic in the present moment, I thought it was important to engage with. And in any case, the city will drive you crazy. This is the kind of thing I've been publishing in Egypt as well, when I'm allowed, just to be able to have a bit of a venting space. Anyways, thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. That was a fascinating ride. I have lots and lots of questions, but I'll leave them for tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be very lively, I suspect. I wanted to hear you say a bit more about Karim and the particular moment of his marginalization, silencing, etc. This is a moment, a kind of high moment, early 1960s for the Nasser regime. And the moment of that Nasser is in the middle of a kind of, the great moment of the non-aligned project, etc., of which he's central. What is it, do you think, about Karim that threatens the Nasser regime? And could you say a bit more about?
I can speculate some things, and speculation is what we kind of have to do a lot of, unfortunately, in the absence of... again, even my approach or my appreciation of what a document is, going back to my very first vignette, sitting in front of a prosecutor, saying one thing, seeing another being written, because that's how a state document needs to be created sometimes. You want to close the case, doesn't matter what the person being questioned is saying, the prosecutor wants to close the case. So he knows what he needs to say to close the case. So my very concept of a document, even if I have access to more legal documents that tell me more about his predicament or what his trouble was, my trust now has been really shaken when you experience firsthand, the falsification of events, right, like that. So on top of it, we also don't have much. And the son talks mostly about himself. So, okay. What did he threaten? I think a couple of things. He was very outspoken. And he garnered a large audience. Having a large audience, being outspoken, is a deadly combination in any dictatorial/colonial setting, because the post-colonial state behaves colonially in the sense that it controls the environment. It shapes who gets to eat how much. Sometimes, it gets really to the nitty-gritty of what any other colonial state would be doing, is just being done now by military generals who want to control the environment, what gets to be said, how much is being spent on what. These are very colonial tactics. So I think he was someone for me that's fascinating. He is someone fascinating for me because during official colonialism, he faced a difficult time when he returned to Cairo to teach at the university, predominantly British led university. So he had a hard time then. And then independence comes, and then he has a hard time still. And then, in fact, even a worse fate is delivered. So he's not alone, you know. So, you know, feminists who were part of the independence, calls for independence, the protest movement, you know, this is when they suddenly just jumped out of a balcony, you know, like during the height of the Nasser national, you know, this is when a lot of people vanished one way or another, whether by just no longer existing in bodily form at least, or sitting at home for the rest of their lives, and so on. All I want to say is that this persists until today. This is why I find it a really interesting story, because something about his story really, I was attracted to him initially as a student because I wanted to really look at what does this transition from colonialism to independence mean in terms of architecture, and he was someone who bridged that fault line. So it made it very easy to me to think, oh, well, he blurs that line. Let me see what his life was about. One can argue that it was more continuity of, you know, silencing of voices just under another name. Other people before him faced that fate from direct colonial authorities. So that's how I would like to see it. Is the continuities of suppression, really. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this vast presentation. But maybe following up, Shaheen's fate is interesting because he sort of gets a second chance, right? He's allowed to make he requested to make the movie, the state finances the movie. They don't pay attention to how the movie is made until it's finished, burn all the copies but one, and then refinance the second version to sort of save face and correct the narrative. But that's a somewhat exceptional sort of second chance.
Yeah.
And can you maybe develop a little bit about how this occurred and how this and how he followed, or sort of how the history continues from this point in terms of his relationship to the state?
Yeah. I mean, second chances, I guess, are rare. I wouldn't call it a second chance in the sense of he, in interviews, expressed, for example, that the original film is his film, and he distances himself from the authorship of the second film, since he, had to do it under pressure, maybe as a condition to be able to return to Egypt. I'm not really sure of the details. Maybe somebody knows more about this. But also by that point, Nasser is dead, 1972. So the high dam moment for propaganda to make it this like grand transformational infrastructural thing, that already was fizzling out, even though, you know, the project was still pretty new. But as you can see, if people are literally living near the dam, having to make tin lights or oil lamps out of tin cans, you know, how many people are paying the ticket to go see the propaganda movie anyway? So it's kind of, I'm not really sure if it's even saving face. I have no idea why they made it a second time, but they reused a lot of the footage from the first film, so it's not like they shot it entirely, but they cut out entire scenes and then they included new actors, so it's a mess. It's horrible, but you should watch it for that, you know, because that's not how you should make cinema, I guess. You know, like, it's a very clear situation in which you can see what somebody authored as a creative, and then what happens when your boss comes in and like puts it onto your head is like, you're not gonna sleep tonight until you make it my way, you know. Like, just, so like the second movie is just horrible, even though it has like, you know, Saad Hosni was like a really famous actor, you know, very loved by them, but that didn't save it, I don't think. So I wouldn't even call it a second chance. It was just maybe his ticket back to his country, which, you know, that's worth paying.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very, very touching. I'm Egyptian as well, and I was seeing this, and I keep thinking in my back head, if you can even present this in Egypt anywhere, and it's not even possible, which is sad. I have two questions. First is, are you doing anything with the things that are held by the officials for your exhibition?
So they were released eventually.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
okay.
I should have said that. I mean, me sitting with the prosecutor was to close the case.
Okay.
That's hence me saying whatever, doesn't matter, because he was writing what he needed to close the case, because there was no case. So those were released, and now they're in London. And I'll never see them again, because also the British Museum treated me as a short-time contractor, and now I have no reason to touch any of the stuff that I spent 2 years working on. Whoops.
Okay, but that's good news, though.
Yeah, well, I'm neither in Cairo or London, so I'm okay, I suppose. Yeah.
And I saw in your slides very, very briefly Hassan Fathi and his book Architecture for the Poor. It's one of the books that I loved, and I wanted to hear like a couple of sentences from you on like Hassan Fathi and his
so in
impact.
case others didn't notice, so that was on the timeline where I was trying to include not just buildings and individuals, but then books that they may have been published, magazines and so on, so that you can see, for example, I was born in 1981 when also Sadat was assassinated. I was a good luck charm, I suppose. I was born 2 months before. And then that's when 2 major architecture magazines were published, 1981. I wouldn't have even put them together. One was in the US, but about the developing world, which is just like poor Muslims. And then the other, Ma'mar, and then the other one was in Egypt, Alam al-Bina. So both of them are 1981. So that was why the exercise for me was useful, because then you see about, and Hassan Fathi's book was published a few years earlier than that. So seeing those things in relationship to one another perhaps made me also rethink what I think about something like Hassan Fathi's book. Because when you read these things in isolation, especially as an immigrant student in the West, trying to reconnect with your history and culture, futile exercise by reading these individual things, it's a very different perspective when you realize, so there was a conversation, the Aga Khan Award is established, somebody was interested in this thing that was actually published in Arabic almost a decade or something before, and then suddenly it's translated in English. That's why we know it by its name. It's architecture for the poor, because of course an architect is not poor, but he does things for the poor. The discourse there's a developmental discourse. That's why the Ma'mar magazine established in 81 is the developing world, so there's that. So you can see why Hassan Fathi's book is there. I think that's more valuable, at least just for context and an awareness of historical context, rather than just what I think about the book as a piece of discourse on its own. You know what I mean? Why it was translated into English, why it was published at that time, what was happening around it, who else was publishing what. That's kind of why I think its placement in the timeline can be hopefully interesting for someone new. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's fantastic, really. And I really appreciate the fact that you're blurring that, the professional, the academic, and the personal. I think is super important. And on that note, I was wondering how your experience of Paris is allowing you to conceptualize, to write. Are you allowing it to enter?
Amazing question, because I have no idea. I'm still figuring it out. It's nice. It's nice to be paid. It's nice to be in Paris, and it's nice to not feel watched, which is the case in Cairo. That's not nice. And it's nice to just be in a setting in which I don't have to explain myself all the time, even though I chose to do a presentation today where I'm explaining myself all the time, because this is what one ends up having to do in a lot of situations. The idea, Paris has been great. The idea is to actually get some of these ideas now written down in a manuscript so it can get published. So there's 2 books in the works. One is on Sayyid Karim and one is on the objects. So Paris is now just kind of like my host shell. I would love to be able to engage with more spaces within Paris to change the conversation or my ideas. Although if they are anything like the ones in London, then maybe you shouldn't, because London was rough for that. But anyway, I'm very grateful to be here. Hopefully I get some of these books done. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed.
Thank you.